Hello everyone. Our today's lecture is from the series of lectures on respiratory system. In our last lecture, we have already explained about the anatomy and physiology of respiratory system. Now, in current lecture, we will talk about the breathing mechanism, how the respiratory system works. The main function of the respiratory system is pulmonary ventilation, which is the movement of air between the atmosphere and the lung by inspiration and expiration, driven by the respiratory muscles. The respiratory system works as a whole to extract the oxygen from the inhaled air and eliminate the carbon dioxide from the body by exhalation. The upper respiratory tract mainly has an air conducting function, while the lower respiratory tract serves both the conducting and respiratory functions. Besides its main function, we have already studied that respiratory system used to conduct the air to the lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract also performs several other functions. As mentioned earlier, that the nasal cavity and paranasal sinuses change the properties of the air by humidifying and warming it in order to prepare it for the process of respiration. The air is also filtered from dust, pathogens, and other particles by the nasal hair follicles and the ciliary epithelium. The space between the outer surface of the lungs and inner thoracic wall is known as pleural space. This is usually filled with pleural fluid, forming a seal which holds the lungs against the thoracic wall. We have a parietal pleura, the red surface, and the visceral pleura that is attached to the lung, the blue one. While the space between these two, as we can see here in the short diagram, visceral pleura and the parietal pleura, there is a space between these two lines that is known as pleural space. This pleural space is usually filled with pleural fluid, forming a seal which holds the lungs against the thoracic wall by the force of surface tension. This seal ensures that when the thoracic cavity expands or reduces in its size, the lungs undergo expansion or reduction in size accordingly. During breathing, the contraction and relaxation of muscles acts to change the volume of the thoracic cavity. As the thoracic cavity and lungs move together, this changes the volume of the lungs, in turn changing the pressure inside the lungs. As we have already seen that Boyle's law states that the volume of the gas, that is the volume of air, for example, that is entering the lung, is inversely proportional to the pressure when temperature is constant, and we know that temperature of our body remains constant approximately around 37 degree. Therefore, when the volume of the thoracic cavity increases, the volume of the lungs increases and the pressure within the lungs decreases according to this law. And when the volume of the thoracic cavity decreases, the volume of the lungs decreases and the pressure within the lungs increases. We can observe that always a negative pressure is generated in this pleural space, and this negative pressure might remains approximately -2 millimeter mercury. Elastic fibers, there are elastic fibers in lung that recoil and push out, and all these walls keep the lung inflated and facilitated lung movements. There are basically three important methods that involve in the process of respiration: ventilation, diffusion, and perfusion. First of all, we will talk about ventilation, how this happens. In ventilation, there are two processes that are important: inhalation and exhalation. Inhalation means entering the air inside the lungs, and exhalation means breathing out, that is, taking air out from the lungs. While talking about inhalation, the action of breathing is in and out is due to actually changes of pressure within the thorax in comparison with the outside. So in the process of inhalation, We can observe here that in this diagram, the diaphragm moves down for that forcing air into the airways. Intercostal muscles, the muscles in between the ribs. Intercostal muscles, the muscles that attach and holds the ribs together. These muscles contract and enlarging cavity even more and more in order to expand and make more space for the air entering the lungs. Membranes move with the contractions. Surface tension in alveoli and surfactant keep them from collapsing, and other muscles can force a deeper inhalation. Inspiration or inhalation is the phase of ventilation in which air enters the lungs, and it is initiated by contraction of the inspiratory muscles. There are two important muscles that involved in the process of inspiration: diaphragm and external intercostal muscles. For diaphragm, it flattens and extending the superior or the inferior dimension, that is towards downside, of the thoracic cavity in order to make more space. Similarly, in external intercostal muscles elevates the ribs, as we can see here properly in this diagram. They elevates the ribs and sternum and extending the interior or posterior dimension of the thoracic cavity. The action of the inspiratory muscles results in an increase in the volume of the thoracic cavity. As we can also see here that in case of inspiration, chest wall and lungs expand, then expansion of ribs moves sternum upward and outward. So the action of these muscles result in an increase in the volume of the cavity. As the lungs are held against the inner thoracic wall by the pleural seal, so they also undergo an increase in the volume. As per the Boyle's law, increase in volume results in the decrease in pressure within the lungs. So the air can easily enter in the lung due to decrease in pressure gradient. This diagram also explains very well the process of inspiration and shows organs in detail taking part in the respiratory system. Pulmonary ventilation. The intrapleural pressure, that is the pressure in space between the parietal and the visceral pleura, that is the pressure between in the pleural cavity shown in the red line. It's very important in order to enter air inside the lungs. Pleural fluid, it has a minimal volume and on average, it has at least this pressure in the pleural cavity also remains below atmospheric pressure. We know that atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeter mercury throughout the respiratory cycle. So the intrapleural pulmonary pressure or presence or pressure in resting alveoli is equal to 760 millimeter mercury, that is equal to atmospheric pressure. At sea level, air pressure is 760 millimeter mercury. So the change in size of the lungs causes the pressure inside to drop to about 758 millimeter mercury. During inhalation and even exhalation, lungs do not move independently. Muscle movement alone does not allow one to breathe or lifting weight or running, etc. But movement of specific muscles is required for this purpose. Contraction and relaxation of muscles associated with the chest cause changes in the volume of the thoracic cavity and lung volume. Similarly, changes in volume causes change in pressure. Gas or air that enters the lung will rush from the higher pressure, that is outside, into a lower pressure, that is inside the lungs, or down a concentration gradient. Thus, by filling the lungs, whole costal muscles and diaphragm moves to make space for the air. Thus, air makes its way in the lungs. You can understand this process with an example. The process of inhalation is just like filling of balloon. Balloon cannot increase its volume on its own. But when we blow air in the balloon, it increases in its volume and makes space for the air. So there is in lungs there is not much space to expand. How does the respiratory system clean the air? Respiratory system has built-in methods to keep harmful things in the air away from entering the lungs. Hairs in the nose help filter out large particles. Tiny hairs called cilia, we can see here the mucus and the cilia, along the air passage move in a sweeping motion to keep the passage clean. But if we breathe in harmful things like cigarette smoke, the cilia can stop working. This can lead to health problems like bronchitis. So cells in the trachea and bronchial tubes make mucus that keeps air passage moist and helps keep things like dust, bacteria and viruses and allergy causing things out of the lungs. So in this way, the respiratory system remains clean. Now comes the process of exhalation. The action of breathing in and out is due to changes of pressure. We have already seen in last slides within the thorax in comparison with the outside. Now the atmospheric pressure. The pressure is necessary for breathing, which is why it is difficult to breathe in high altitudes and also why a punctured lung can be dangerous. So in the process of exhalation, diaphragm moves up, forcing air out. Intercostal muscles relax, shrinking the cavity in opposite to the breathing in situation. Membranes move with the contractions. Surface tension in alveoli keep them from collapsing again, and other muscles can also force a deeper exhalation and helps air to move out of the lungs. So we can say here that it's a passive process where no muscle contraction occurs. But in this process, that is in the process of exhalation, the muscles relax, tissues return to their normal shape and size, they decrease in the size of the thoracic cavity and lungs, and increase pressure inside and ultimately forcing air out of the lungs. Expiration is the phase of ventilation in which air is expelled from the lungs. So it is initiated by relaxation of the inspiratory muscles. Again, we can see here in this diagram the two important things taking part is participating in the process of exhalation. The diaphragm that relaxes to return to its resting position. Here it relaxes to its resting position, to its normal position and reducing the superior or inferior dimension of the thoracic cavity. And the second one, the most important organ that participate is the external intercostal muscles, the orange one in this diagram. They relax to depress the ribs and sternum, reduce the interior or posterior dimension of the thoracic cavity. That is intercostal muscles and abdominal muscles, they contract for active expiration only and ultimately release air out of the lungs. The relaxation of the inspiratory muscles results in a decrease in the volume of the cavity. The elastic recoil of the previously expanded lung tissue allows them to return to their original size. So again, as per Boyle's law, a decrease in lung volume results in an increase in the pressure within the lungs. So ultimately, due to moving diaphragm up and intercostal muscles on the inside down, the volume of the lungs or the thoracic cavity decreases, due to which pressure inside the lung increases. Now the pressure inside the lung is now greater than the external environment. So it means that air moves out of the lungs down the pressure gradient. That is from high pressure towards lower pressure. The diagram shows a comparison between the inhaled air and exhaled air. The composition of the, if we talk about the composition of the inhaled and exhaled air, we can see here that there is 21% oxygen present in the inhaled air, while exhaled air has 16% oxygen. That is, the 5% oxygen is used up in the blood and has been absorbed in the blood plasma. While carbon dioxide, there is only 0.04% carbon dioxide present in the inhaled air, while exhaled air contains 5% carbon dioxide. So this carbon dioxide is coming from metabolic activities and other activities of the muscles and tissues, of the body tissues. While nitrogen, there is no change in the composition of the nitrogen. Inhaled air is dry as compared to the exhaled air, that is moist. While inhaled air, it depends, the temperature of the inhaled air depends upon the environment. It might be colder as in winter or might be warmer as in summer, but the exhaled air is always approximately at 37 degree due to the body temperature. And if we talk about cleanliness, the inhaled air might be dirtier, while the exhaled air would be always cleaner. Only it may contain bacteria and viruses depending upon the if there is any infection or bronchitis or anything, or lungs have if lungs has any infection like pneumonia, etc. The next is the forced expiration. That is the pulmonary ventilation. The difference in pulmonary ventilation during quiet breathing versus forced breathing. Now the question arises, what happens in case of forced breathing? What is a forced breathing? It's an active mode of breathing which utilizes additional muscles to rapidly expand and contract the thoracic cavity volume. It most commonly occurs during exercise, running, during high blood pressure, and during talking rapidly. So what happens during this type of breathing? It's an active inspiration process. That is, active inspiration involves in the contraction of the accessory muscles of breathing, in addition to those muscles which are already involved during quiet inspiration, that is the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. All of these muscles, the accessory muscles, along with the normal muscles, they act to increase the volume of the thoracic cavity. These are the list of accessory muscles to participate in the forced breathing. First of all, scalenes. They elevates the upper rib. Sternocleidomastoids, they elevates the sternum. Pectoralis major and minor both, they pulls ribs up outwards. Serratus anterior, they elevates the ribs. And similarly, latissimus dorsi, they also elevates the lower rib. Then if we talk about the active expiration utilizes the contraction of several thoracic and abdominal muscles. These muscles act to decrease the volume of the thoracic cavity. For example, anterolateral abdominal wall, which increases the intra-abdominal pressure, pushing the diaphragm further upwards into the thoracic cavity. Internal intercostal muscle, which depresses the ribs, and innermost intercostal muscles, they also depresses the ribs. So we can say that forced breathing is an active process. That is, it involves muscle contraction both during inhalation and exhalation. Contraction of intercostal muscles takes place during this process, which pulls ribs cage downward. Abdominal muscles, they also use abdominal muscles. And what abdominal muscles perform? They pull sternum down and squeeze abdominal cavity. It also forces more air out than the normal volume of the air. Now, if we compare all the breathing processes discussed till now, we can say that during quiet inhalation or the normal process of inhalation, which is an active process, diaphragm and external intercostal muscles takes part during this process. And during quiet exhalation, that is the normal process of exhalation, it's a passive process and it allows only muscle groups to relax. While during forced inhalation, it's an active process where diaphragm, external intercostal muscles, and some other accessory respiratory muscles represented here, they take part during this process and are activated when respiration increases significantly. While during forced exhalation, it's also an active process as compared to the normal exhalation process. It involves accessory respiratory muscles, which are listed here, and are activated when respiration increases significantly. This diagram shows the location and the positions of accessory muscles. As we can see here in this diagram, the sternocleidomastoids muscles, scalene muscles are present here, pectoralis minor muscles and even major muscles, transversus thoracic muscle, serratus anterior muscle, and then comes the diaphragm. While on the right side we can see here the internal intercostal muscles and external intercostal muscles. External these and the internal ones. During the process of inhalation, we can see the participation of scalenes, sternocleidomastoid muscles, pectoralis minor and major, serratus anterior muscles and external intercostal muscles and the diaphragm. While during exhalation, we can see here the participation of transversus thoracic muscle and the intercostal muscles. While the rectus abdominal and other abdominal muscles are not shown here, but they also participate during the process of forced exhalation. Intrapleural breathing. What is the intrapleural breathing? I have already observed that during that parietal pleura and visceral pleura, both of these lines make a cavity known as pleural cavity. The pressure in this cavity participates majorly in the process of respiration. Actually, we can say that pressure in this cavity is responsible for the air to move in and to move out. Intrapleural breathing is used to refer to the pressure actually that is present in the space in the pleural cavity. The pressure in this region is normally less than the atmospheric pressure. That is the reason that air moves in the lungs. This is the reason why pleural pressure is termed as negative pressure, because it remains always less as compared to the atmospheric pressure. There may be 2 to 4 millimeter difference lies between the pleural cavity pressure and the normal atmospheric pressure. The lung movement is governed by the pressure gradient. The transpulmonary pressure which exists between the pleura and the lungs. The difference in the pressures between intrapulmonary and intrapleural pressure is known as transpulmonary pressure. There are two terms will be utilized during this process. The intrapleural pressure, the pressure that is present in the pleural cavity, and intrapulmonary pressure, that is the pressure present at the alveoli. So the difference between both of these is known as transpulmonary pressure. That is the difference between 0 millimeter and -4 millimeter mercury. Intrapleural pressure remains almost at 756 millimeter mercury, that is -4 millimeter mercury. The pressure is in the pleural cavity while breathing turns negative, while there is an increase in the transpulmonary pressure, causing the lungs to expand. While during expiration, the lungs recoil as a result of an increase in the pleural pressure. At least -2 millimeter mercury pressure is always maintained in the lungs at this stage, at this cavity, in order to avoid collapsing of the lungs and to maintain the flow of air in the lungs. The competing forces inside the thoracic results in the formation of negative intrapleural pressure. One of these forces is associated with the lungs' elasticity. The lungs have elastic tissues which cause it to be pulled inwards of the thoracic wall. An inward pull of the lung tissue is also generated by the surface tension of the alveolar fluid. The inward tension generated from the lungs is opposed by forces from the thoracic wall and the pleural fluid. In this slide, we can observe the changes in the partial pressure of the gases at different stages of respiration, such as at start or at normal stage when lungs are not in the process of respiration. The atmospheric pressure 760 millimeter mercury. The air enters at this pressure. While at pleural cavity, we have already observed that the at the pleural cavity, the intrapleural pressure is maintained at approximately 756 millimeter, or sometimes at least 758 millimeter mercury is maintained in order to avoid the collapsing of the lungs. While as the inhalation starts, the pressure decrease ultimately increase in lungs volume. For example, at pleural cavity, the pressure is 756 millimeter. That is the difference of minus 4 millimeter mercury cause air to rush in the lungs along the concentration gradient. That is from higher concentration towards lower concentration. Ultimately, the pressure in the lungs reaches the 760 millimeter mercury here. In these slides, we can observe the difference between the lungs when there is no breathing or no respiration is taking place and during the inhalation. We can see here that during no breathing, the pressure at intrapleural pressure, it is 756 millimeter mercury. While during inhalation, the pressure drops down and it reaches 754 millimeter mercury. Due to this drop down in intrapleural pressure, air comes in the lungs and ultimately causing the decrease in pressure 759 millimeter mercury in the lungs. Atmospheric pressure equals intrapleural pressure, that is 760 millimeter mercury, and intrapleural pressure is below 760, that is 756. While intrapulmonary pressure during inhalation drops to 759 millimeter mercury and intrapleural pressure drops to 754 millimeter mercury. In this diagram, we can observe the four different stages. That is, when there is quiet inspiration and quiet expiration. At quiet inspiration, we can have already observed the difference between no breathing and inhalation. While at quiet expiration, we can observe the opposite case. That is, due to when air comes in the lungs, the pressure increases inside the lungs. That is, the pressure reaches 761 millimeter. 1 millimeter mercury is more than the normal pressure. So, air ultimately rush out of the lungs, that is from higher concentration towards lower concentration. Here, the important point to note is that partial pressure is termed as the concentration of the gas. We will observe this phenomena in the upcoming slides. Now comes gas exchange. What is the gas exchange? Gas exchange is the biological process through which gases are transferred across cell membranes to either enter or leave the blood. Why we need oxygen? Oxygen is constantly needed by cells for aerobic cellular respiration, and the same process continually produces carbon dioxide as a waste product. That is, cells take oxygen in, and at red blood cells, the oxygen is sent to muscles, tissues, and different body organs where oxygen is utilized, while the other metabolic activities produce carbon dioxide as a result, which are ultimately the carbon dioxide is dissolved in the blood plasma, which is then expired out from the lungs. Gas exchange takes place between the blood and cells throughout the body, while oxygen leaving the blood and entering the cells, the carbon dioxide leaving the cells and entering the blood. Gas exchange also takes place between the blood and the air in the lungs, with oxygen entering the blood from the inhaled air inside the lungs, and carbon dioxide on opposite leaving the blood and entering the air to be exhaled from the lungs. In this schematic diagram, we can also see here the same mechanism. Oxygen is entering the lungs, and from lungs, oxygen is entering towards the blood, that is towards the heart. After passing from the blood, left atrium and the left ventricle, the oxygen is transported towards the metabolizing tissues or other body tissues where oxygen is needed. Here, as a result of metabolizing activities, the carbon dioxide is produced, which is then, after passing from the blood, is exported towards the lungs and is exhaled out. What is the role of surfactant in gas exchange in the lungs? What is a pulmonary surfactant? It's a surface active complex of phospholipids and proteins formed by type 2 alveolar cells. The proteins and lipids, they make up the surfactant and have both hydrophilic and hydrophobic regions. By adsorbing to the air-water interface of alveoli with hydrophilic head groups in the water and direction hydrophobic tail facing towards the air, the main lipid component of surfactant is dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine and is used to reduce surface tension. What is the function of the pulmonary surfactant? To increase pulmonary compliance, we will see compliance afterwards. To prevent, that is, to prevent collapsing of the alveoli or atrium at the end of expiration. It keeps alveoli moist and avoid collapsing of the alveoli. To facilitate recruitment of collapsed airways. So alveoli can be compared to gas in water. As the alveoli, they are wet and surround a central air space. So the surface tension acts at the air-water interface. That is, the if we talk about alveoli, the surface tension or the pulmonary surfactant act between alveoli and the gas interface and tends to make the bubble smaller by decreasing the surface area of the interface. What is a compliance? We have already talked about pulmonary surfactant that they work to increase the pulmonary compliance. Compliance is actually the ability of lungs and thorax to expand. That is the ability of thoracic chest cavity to expand. Lung compliance is defined as the volume change per unit of pressure change across the lung. Measurements of lung volume obtained during the controlled inflation or deflation of the normal lung show that the volumes obtained during deflation exceed those during inflation at a given pressure. This difference in inflation and deflation volumes, that is the difference in inflation volume and deflation volume at a given pressure, is called hysteresis and is due to the air-water surface tension that occurs at the beginning of inflation. However, the surfactant decreases the alveolar surface tension, as also seen in cases of premature infants with the infant respiratory distress syndrome. Actually, the infant respiratory distress syndrome means in the newborns which do not have enough pulmonary surfactant and their lungs are not capable to breathe normally. So, in this case, artificial pulmonary surfactants are given to the newborn babies. The normal surface tension for water is 70 dyne per centimeter, and in the lungs it is 25 dyne per centimeter. However, at the end of the expiration, the compressed surfactant phospholipid molecule decrease the surface tension to very low and near zero levels. So pulmonary surfactant thus greatly reduce surface tension, increasing compliance, allowing the lungs to inflate much more easily, thereby reducing the work of breathing and to become breathing more easy and rapid. It reduces the pressure. Surfactant also reduces the pressure difference which are needed to allow the lungs to inflate. So the lungs compliance and ventilation, they decrease when lung tissue becomes diseased or fibrotic. If there is any problem or if there is less amount of pulmonary surfactant is present, the lung compliance and ventilation will decrease. They also regularize the alveolar size. As the alveoli increase in size, the surfactant becomes more spread out over the surface of the liquid, that is over the surface of the alveoli. This increases surface tension effectively, slowing the rate of expansion of the alveoli. This also helps all alveoli in the lungs to expand at the same rate, as one that expands more quickly will experience a large rise in surface tension. So it slows its rate of expansion. It also means that the rate of shrinking of alveoli is more regular if
one reduces in size more quickly, the surface tension will also reduce. Prevention, it also causes prevention of fluid accumulation and maintenance of dryness of airways. Surface tension draws fluid from capillaries to the alveolar space. Surfactant reduces fluid accumulation and keeps the airways dry by reducing surface tension. What is its composition? If we talk about its composition, the 40% is DPPC, that is dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine. 40% is other phospholipids. 10% is surfactant protein, which includes SPA, B, C, and D. And only 10% are neutral lipids, that is cholesterol, etc. And there are some traces of other substances. Even though the surface tension can be greatly reduced by pulmonary surfactant, this effect will depend on the surfactant's concentration also on the interface, on the alveoli. The interface concentration has a saturation limit, which depends on temperature and mixture composition. So we can say that pressure of inhaled air is not enough by itself to open the individual alveoli of the lungs or to inflate the alveoli, but which contain a very small amount of fluid. But fluid would normally cause the alveoli walls to stick together. Body creates these pulmonary surfactants which disrupt surface tension inside alveoli and preventing them from sticking together when the air is expired out, that is during the process of exhalation. The role of pulmonary surfactant become more and more important. As we can see here, in the normal alveoli, when the pulmonary surfactants are in sufficient quantity, the alveoli seems open and inflated. But during a collapsed alveoli, when there are not much enough quantity of surfactants, pulmonary surfactants are available, they are collapsed and deflated much more than the normal value. It's important that baby is put on a ventilator and given artificial surfactant if at birth he is experiencing the respiratory distress syndrome. This diagram shows gas exchange in the lungs. Alveoli are the basic functional units of the lungs, where gas exchange takes place between the air and the blood. Alveoli are tiny air sacs that consist of connective and epithelial tissues, as we can see here. The connective tissue includes elastic fibers that allow alveoli to stretch and expand as they fill with air during inhalation. During exhalation, the fibers allow alveoli to spring back and expel the air. That is during deflation. Special cells in the walls of the alveoli secrete a film of fatty substances which we have already talked about and are known as pulmonary surfactant. This substance prevents alveoli walls from collapsing and sticking together. So other cells in alveoli include macrophages, which are more scavengers, mobile scavengers, and engulf and destroy foreign particles or foreign microbes or virus, for example, or any other dangerous microbes which can cause infection and manage to reach the lungs in inhaled air. Because we have already seen in our last slide that inhaled air is dirtier as compared to the exhaled air. It may contain foreign particles, dust, pollens, and some microbes. So it's important that that our alveoli have some good macrophages that can engulf these dangerous particles. As shown in this figure, alveoli are arranged in group-like clusters of grapes. Each alveolus is covered with a epithelium that is just one cell thick. It is surrounded by a bed of pulmonary capillaries, as we can see here, each of which has a wall of epithelium just one cell thick. As a result, that is just being one cell thick, the gases must cross through only two cells to pass between an alveolus and its surrounding capillaries. That is one cell of the alveolus and the other cell of the capillary. The pulmonary artery, also shown in the figure, carries deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. The pulmonary artery shown here, it carries deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. Then the blood travels. This is the only artery in the body that carry deoxygenated blood. And the pulmonary vein, it's the only vein in the body that carry oxygenated blood. Then the blood travels, this blood travels through the pulmonary capillaries bed where it picks up oxygen and releases carbon dioxide in the lungs. Actually the gas exchange between oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place here at the surface of the alveoli. The blood takes oxygen from the alveoli and transfers carbon dioxide to the alveoli. So we can observe here a color change here. That is, the pulmonary artery has a blue color. It means, it indicates that it has a carbon dioxide, high concentration of carbon dioxide. But as long as the gas exchange takes place and it is saturated with oxygen, the color turns to red. So the pulmonary vein has a red color blood, that is the oxygenated blood. The oxygenated blood then leaves the lungs and travels back to the heart through pulmonary vein. There are four pulmonary veins, two for each lung, and all four carry oxygenated blood to the heart. From the heart, the oxygenated blood is then pumped to cells throughout the body. This diagram shows the anatomy of the alveoli. There are some connective tissues, alveolar sac, alveolar duct that carry air towards the alveoli, mucus gland that produce mucus, and mucosal lining, atrium, pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein. The color shows them. Then comes the mechanism of gas exchange. Gas exchange occurs by diffusion across cell membrane. That is, the oxygen moves from higher concentration towards lower concentration, that is across the concentration gradient. The process is known as simple diffusion. And carbon dioxide also moves from higher concentration towards lower concentration, that is from deoxygenated blood towards alveoli, that is along the concentration gradient, from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. This is a passive process that requires no energy. To diffuse across cell membranes, gases must first be dissolved in the liquid, and the liquid is blood here or plasma. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported around the body dissolved in blood. Both gases bind to the protein hemoglobin in red blood cells here. The hemoglobin is the only molecule in the blood that is capable to carry oxygen and carbon dioxide. Although oxygen does so more effectively than carbon dioxide, some carbon dioxide also dissolves in blood plasma because hemoglobin is also efficiently bind with the carbon dioxide. As shown in this figure, oxygen is inhaled air diffuses into a pulmonary capillary from the alveolus towards the capillary. Carbon dioxide in the blood, on the other hand, diffuses in the opposite direction. The carbon dioxide can then be exhaled from the body. This is the diagram of a single alveolus in a tiny structure that is specialized for gas exchange between inhaled air and the blood in pulmonary capillaries. Gas exchange by diffusion. Gas exchange by diffusion depends on having a large surface area through which gases can pass. Although each alveolus is tiny, there are hundreds of millions of them in the lungs of a healthy adult. So the total surface area for gas exchange is huge. This is the reason that alveoli, they are so small in size in order to have a huge surface area for exchange of gases. It is estimated that this surface area may be as great as 100 meter cube or approximately 1076 cubic feet. Often we think of lungs as balloons, but this type of structure would have very limited surface area and there wouldn't be enough space for blood to interface with the air in the alveoli. So the structure of alveoli take in the lungs is more like a giant mass of soap bubbles. That is millions of tiny little chambers making up one large mass. This is what increases the surface area, giving blood lots of space to come into close enough contact to exchange gases by diffusion. Gas exchange by diffusion also depends on maintaining a steep concentration gradient for oxygen and carbon dioxide. Continuous blood flow in the capillaries and constant breathing maintain this gradient. Each time we inhale, there is a greater concentration of oxygen in the air, in the alveoli, than there is the blood in the pulmonary capillaries. As a result, oxygen diffuses from air inside the alveoli into the blood. This is the structure of the alveoli and this is the blood capillary where oxygen and the carbon dioxide transportation is occurring. The oxygen diffuses from air inside the alveoli into the blood in the capillaries, and carbon dioxide in contrast is more concentrated in the blood in the pulmonary capillaries than it is in the air inside. It is in the air inside the alveoli. As a result, carbon dioxide diffuses in the opposite direction. The cells of the body have a much lower concentration of oxygen than the cells of the body have a much lower concentration of oxygen than does the oxygenated blood that reaches them in peripheral capillaries, which are the capillaries that supply tissues throughout the body. As a result, oxygen diffuses from peripheral capillaries into body cells. The opposite is true of carbon dioxide. It has a much higher concentration in body cells than it does in the blood of the peripheral capillaries. Thus, carbon dioxide diffuses from body cells into the peripheral capillaries. Gas exchange during respiration occurs primarily through diffusion. Here, it's important to talk about partial pressure. Partial pressure is a measure of the concentration of the individual components in a mixture of gases. The total pressure exerted by the mixture is the sum of the partial pressure of the components in the mixture. So, the rate of diffusion of a gas is proportional to its partial pressure within the total gas mixture. The respiratory process can be better understood by examining the properties of gases. Gases move freely, but gas particles are constantly hitting the walls of their vessel, thereby producing gas pressure. Air is a mixture of gases. It constitutes primarily nitrogen 78% approximately, while oxygen is 21%. Water vapors are also present 0.5% and carbon dioxide 0.04%. Now each gas component of that mixture exerts a pressure on the lung. The pressure for an individual gas in the mixture is the partial pressure of that gas. So we can say here the partial pressure is the concentration of that gas. Approximately 21% of atmospheric gas is oxygen. Carbon dioxide, however, is found in relatively small amount, 0.04%. The partial pressure for oxygen is much greater than that of carbon dioxide. It means that the concentration of oxygen is much more as compared to the carbon dioxide. So the partial pressure of any gas can be, if we calculate, it would be ultimately 150 millimeter mercury for oxygen. These pressures determine the gas exchange or the flow of gas in the system. Oxygen and carbon dioxide will flow according to their pressure gradient from high concentration towards lower concentration. Therefore, understanding the partial pressure of each gas will help in understanding how gases move in the respiratory system. In short, we can say that the change in the partial pressure, yeah, that is the concentration from the alveoli to the capillaries, drives the oxygen into the tissues, and the carbon dioxide drives from tissues towards the blood. The blood is then transported to the lungs where difference in pressure in the alveoli result in the movement of carbon dioxide out of the blood into the lungs and oxygen into the blood. That's the reason we can, if we look upon the partial pressure concentration of different individual gases, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is at very low limit at ambient air, while that of oxygen is 160 millimeter mercury. While as long as the air reaches the capillaries, here the partial pressure of oxygen decreases as oxygen is utilized now and decreases up to 100 millimeter mercury. while that of carbon dioxide, it starts increasing, that is 40 millimeter mercury. After proper gas exchange between pulmonary and the venous, between artery and the vein, we have observed that the partial pressure of oxygen decreases much more as compared to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which is increasing now, because carbon dioxide is coming from tissues towards blood as a result of some metabolic activities. Now this carbon dioxide, now we can observe that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is much more as compared to the normal ambient air here. So 46 millimeter mercury. That's the reason carbon dioxide will be expelled out easily from the lungs. That is from higher concentration towards lower concentration. While oxygen have low concentration here as compared to the ambient air.